Mythic Rares are pretty cool. It's the highest rarity in Magic, and cards that are mythic tend to have super powerful splashy effects. Many of the best cards in Magic are printed at this rarity, so I thought it would be interesting to do an MTG Top 10 that takes a look at Mythic Rares in a particular color, and that's what we're doing today, with a look at the most important white Mythic Rares ever printed. And what we ended up with is one of the most stacked lists ever. It took 70 points to make the list, and the top 6 all have over 100. To be eligible for this list, a card had to be mono white, and it had to be printed at Mythic Rare in its original printing. In all, there were 180 cards eligible, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. At number 10, it's Elspeth Knight Errant. Since the introduction of the Mythic rarity in 2008's Shards of Alara, almost all Planeswalkers have been printed at Mythic Rare, and it's not very surprising that there are 4 of them in total on the list, starting with Elspeth, who actually was introduced in Shards of Alara, making her one of the first Mythic Rares ever. She costs 2 generic and 2 white and starts with 4 loyalty. She has a +1 that makes a 1/1 soldier token, another +1 that gives a creature +3/+3 and flying until end of turn, and a -8 that gives you an emblem that makes your artifacts, creatures, enchantments, and lands indestructible. Planeswalkers that are reasonably costed and can crank out creature tokens tend to perform pretty well. This is because they come with a built-in way to protect themselves, and this is doubly so when the Planeswalker can raise their loyalty while making a token. So Elspeth can build your board out pretty effectively, and the other +1 can sometimes give you lethal damage out of nowhere, and if she's allowed to reach her ultimate, all those tokens and most of your other permanents will be indestructible. Basically, she's a really sweet value engine, and if she can't win you the game with all those tokens, she probably will with her emblem. Elspeth has found significant success in multiple formats, usually in aggro decks. In Extended, she was played in Zoo. In Modern, she's gained points in Hate Bear, Bant Aggro, and Zoo. She's even played in Legacy creature decks like Maverick and Stoneblade. She's still gaining points in Legacy right now, and that may be enough for her to maintain a spot on this list. At number 9, it's Lyra Dawnbringer. Each color has what Wizards of the Coast calls an iconic creature type. This is a type that really represents the flavor of a particular color, appears on most planes, and tends to be super powerful and splashy, so they largely appear at higher rarities. Angel is the iconic type for white, and virtually every set has a Mythic Rare Angel, so it shouldn't come as a surprise that Lyra Dawnbringer is the first of 3 Angels we're going to see on the list. For 3 generic and 2 white, she's a 5/5 with flying, first strike, and lifelink, and she also gives other angels you control +1/+1 and lifelink. Large flying creatures with lifelink tend to be pretty strong. They make it pretty impossible for your opponent to race, because every time it hits an opponent it creates a gap of 10 life between players. On top of that, because she has first strike, that means she can even hang back and block super effectively the turn she comes down. It was played primarily in more aggressive decks in Standard, like Vehicles, Boros Aggro, and even a Boros Angels deck which got maximum value out of Lyra. She's been played in Modern too, primarily in the sideboard of blue-white control decks. Against more aggressive opponents who don't play much removal that can deal with a 5/5, Lyra Dawnbringer can be pretty insurmountable thanks to lifelink. In Pioneer, the only format it has any top 8s in the recent past, it's primarily gained points in control decks. She's actually slowed down quite a bit, but she also got a reprint in Foundations, making her legal in Standard for the next several years, and it's hard to imagine she won't at least see some sideboard play during that time. At number 8, it's Elesh Norn Grand Cenobite. For 5 generic and 2 white, she's a 4/7 with Vigilance, and she gives your other creatures +2/+2, and all of your opponent's creatures -2/-2. Yeah, Elesh Norn turns a board around in a big way, making it so your creatures end up being a total of +4/+4 bigger than your opponent's creatures, and she of course outright kills anything that is 2/2 or smaller. So 7 mana is a lot, but she certainly gives you a good return on your investment. Of course, this is especially true since people rarely pay 7 mana for her anyway, with most decks that play Elesh Norn finding a way to cheat it into play ahead of schedule. For example, in Standard, Elesh Norn was one of the ultimate end goals for Birthing Pod decks, as you would move up a chain of sacrifices until you got to Elesh. In Modern and Legacy, she's been cheated into play with reanimation spells as well as Indomitable Creativity. Elish Norn also gets put into play with Show and Tell in Legacy and Vintage, and she also shows up in some versions of Oath of Druids and Dredge decks in Vintage. However, over the last few years, new super powerful creatures have started to eat up some of Elish Norn's market share. This is especially true of Atraxa Grand Unifier and Archon of Cruelty, who are both regularly put into play by the various methods I've already mentioned. So, she's slowed down significantly in recent years and may lose ground on this list going forward. At number 7, it's Baneslayer Angel. For 3 generic and 2 white, it's a 5/5 with flying, first strike, lifelink, and protection from demons and dragons. So it's sort of the original version of Lyra Dawnbringer, which we saw earlier, but it trades in being a legendary creature and the Angel Lord upside for protection from 2 creature types. That last part might sound kind of like flavor text, but demons and dragons are the iconic creature types for black and red respectively, and they tend to show up in many formats just like angels do, so it actually comes up sometimes. Like Lyra, Baneslayer provides a frightening finisher that will be able to put the game out of reach for many opponents with just a couple of swings. The Angel was part of the Cobblé deck that dominated Standard in 2011, and didn't see a ton of play after various bannings weakened that deck, but she's gained a few points since a recent Standard legal reprint, primarily in white weenie decks. She's also gained points in blue-white and Esper control decks in Pioneer, and in Modern, the Angels primarily showed up in sideboards. It has slowed down a lot recently, and it's another card that might lose ground on the list going forward. At number 6, it's Archangel Avacyn, another 5-mana angel. She's 3 generic and 2 white for a 4/4 with flying, flash, and vigilance, and when she enters, creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. This counts her, of course, so she can flash in an ambush block and really wreck your opponent's attack, especially if you have some other creatures, and she can also blank a removal spell out of nowhere. She can quite easily generate a 3-for-1 just by entering the battlefield at instant speed. She's also a double-face card, which means she can transform, and she does so when a non-angel creature you control dies, at which point she turns into Avacyn the Purifier, a 6/5 flyer that does 3 damage to each creature and each opponent when she transforms. So she can really reshape the board while doing tons of damage. If you can find a way to transform her while your creatures are indestructible, it can even become one-sided. While the fact she transforms into a red creature technically gives her a red-white identity, I made the decision to have her on this list because you have access to the entire card with only white mana. Anyway, she was basically a staple in white decks and Standard, regardless of whether the deck was a control or aggro deck. This allowed her to put up 95 points in Standard alone. While almost all of Avacyn's points came in Standard, she also has a lone Modern point from 2018, and more recently she's been played in Pioneer, White Weenie, and Spirit Aggro, but she doesn't have a top 8 in any format since 2023. She's by far the least active card on this list, and she's also really the only one whose success is built almost entirely on Standard, so she probably isn't going to stay on this list in the long run, although her utter dominance of Standard will mean it will take a while for her to lose her spot on the list entirely. At number 5, it's Solitude. For 3 generic and 2 white, it's a 3/2 with flash and lifelink, and when it enters, you exile one other target creature, and its controller gains life equal to its power. It also has Evoke, which means you can pay an alternate cost to cast it, and if you go with that cost, it gets sacrificed when it enters the battlefield. So when you do that, you're effectively only paying for that enter the battlefield ability. In this case, the Evoke cost is exiling a white card from your hand. In other words, you can give up a white card and pay no mana at all to Swords to Plowshare something. And should you spend the full mana to cast Solitude, you get a decent body too. Solitude is from Modern Horizons 2, which means the only 60 card formats it's legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and it sees significant play in all of them, since, a free removal spell that can exile almost any creature is pretty insane. It's virtually a staple in Modern, while still being a card you need to account for against anyone playing white in both Legacy and Vintage. It's so heavily played in all 3 formats that it will definitely get higher on this list in the future. At number 4, it's Emiria's Call. For 4 generic and 3 white, it's a sorcery that creates 2 4/4 white Angel Warrior creature tokens with flying, and gives non-angel creatures you control indestructible until your next turn. So, while the card itself isn't an angel, it is yet another white mythic that involves angels. Anyway, if Emiria's Call was always Emiria's Call, it wouldn't be the most amazing card ever. I mean, yeah, you get a couple of nice bodies and some temporary indestructibility, which at the very least means your 2 angels can probably block stuff on your opponent's turn, but it's a super expensive and mana-intensive card. So while it might have seen a tiny bit of play in a format like Standard, it would not be the multi-format all-star it actually is. Because it's not only Emeria's Call, it's a modal double-face card, which means you can choose to play either side of it, and the other side in this case is a land, Emeria Shattered Skyclave, a land that can tap for white and enters tapped unless you pay 3 life. Obviously, only being a land that can produce 1 color that makes you pay life to enter untapped wouldn't be good either, but having both on a single card is a huge deal. This can just be the land you need in the early game, but in the late game if you draw it, you can cast it and get some very real value out of it, unlike every other land in your deck. Basically, it ends up being a plains with massive upside, and having access to that upside is essentially free, since we're talking about a land that can even enter untapped. That flexibility has led to it finding some serious success in multiple formats. There's even a Pioneer Angels deck that can get extra value out of those Angel tokens with Bishop of Wings and Righteous Valkyrie. In Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, it also carries some additional utility, since it's a card that can be pitched to the number 5 card on this list, Solitude, since it's a white card, and that's not true of most lands. Emeria's Call is going to continue to rack up points in multiple formats, and it's likely to continue to climb up the list. At number 3, it's Elspeth Sun's Champion, the second Elspeth and the second Planeswalker we've seen so far. For 4 generic and 2 white, she's a 4 loyalty Planeswalker with 3 abilities. She has a +1 that makes 3 1/1 white soldier creature tokens, a -3 that destroys all creatures with power 4 or greater, and a -7 that makes an emblem that gives all of your creatures +2/+2 and flying. When talking about Elspeth Knight Errant earlier, I mentioned being able to make tokens often determines a Planeswalker's success, especially in white. Well, Elspeth doesn't stop at just making 1 body at a time, she can make 3 while raising her loyalty. This makes it tough for your opponent to ever quickly deal with her by attacking her, and she can also wipe away everything that's really big, which won't ever hit your precious soldier tokens. Her ultimate can turn the army that she can single-handedly build into a bunch of 3/3 flyers too, which usually means the game is over. Elspeth is an amazing win condition for a control deck, since you only have to pay all that mana once, and then you can just use her loyalty abilities every turn and hold up mana to protect her and keep the game under control so that she can easily win the game for you. She's shown up in that role in Block, Standard, and Modern, and more recently in Pioneer, which is really the only format she's seeing play in right now. The printing of Caretaker's talent has been great news for her, as it helped spawn mono-white control decks that are all about winning the game and generating value with tokens, and Elspeth is the perfect Planeswalker for that style of deck. Elspeth is going to continue to put up points going forward, but the 2 cards in front of it have a lead and they're also equally active or more active. Like our number 2 card, which is Gideon, Ally of Zendikar. For 2 generic and 2 white, he's a 4 loyalty Planeswalker with a +1 that makes him indestructible, and he becomes a 5/5 that prevents all damage dealt to him until end of turn, a 0 ability that makes a 2/2 Knight Ally token, and a -4 that gives you an emblem that gives your whole board +1/+1. This is yet another white Planeswalker who makes tokens. Gideon makes a pretty beefy one with that 0 ability and can even rumble himself when you need him to. It's also nice that he can fire off that emblem right away when that's what you need. Like, if your board is already built out, sometimes that's what you want to do. And if you're behind, the 0 ability can very quickly build out the board. Basically, he's hard to take down and can very effectively pressure your opponent in almost any situation. Gideon was utterly dominant during his time in Standard, in a way that very few cards are. Think Sheoldred or Fable of the Mirror Breaker in the more recent past. His highlights in Standard came in decks like Abzan, Selesnya tokens, and Mardu vehicles, but Standard also isn't the only format where he's found success. He's also seen play in Pioneer in decks like White Weenie, Blue-White Spirits, and Mono-White Control. In the past, it's put up top 8s in Modern decks too, like Abzan, Junk, and Hatebear. He's also seen play in Legacy, Death, and Taxes, and he's even gained a few points in Vintage Landstill decks, where for a time he was one of the deck's main win conditions. In that deck, if you can stick Gideon ahead of Standstill, he can just churn out allies, which will eventually make your opponent have to play a spell and pop Standstill. In short, Gideon was a format-defining card in Standard and has seen significant play in every other format it's been legal in, and it's still being heavily played in Pioneer right now. But there's one white mythic rare that has an even more impressive resume, and that card is Monastery Mentor. For 2 generic and a white, it's a 2/2 with Prowess, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you create a 1/1 token with Prowess. So if you've got a lot of non-creature spells, the Mentor can flood the board with them. And all those creatures are very easy to buff in a big way, since all those tokens have Prowess too. Basically, spot removal alone is generally not going to be enough to deal with the Mentor since it can so quickly populate the board. While it only saw some modest success in Standard the first time it got printed, it's actually in Standard again, right now, and this time around it's seeing significant play in blue-white spells decks alongside Haughty Djinn. The deck runs lots of cheap spells to make the Djinn huge early, and all those cheap spells are great fuel for Monastery Mentor too. It's thrived the most in Eternal formats though, where there are lots of powerful and free spells that trigger this ability. In those formats, Monastery Mentor serves as a great win condition in a variety of decks. In Legacy, this has primarily been Miracle decks, and in Vintage, the Mentor spawned an entire archetype named for it. Ultimately, Monastery Mentor proved a little too good for people to be allowed to play a full 4 copies in Vintage, and this led to the Mentor getting restricted in Magic's most powerful format, which tells you a lot about how good this Mythic Rare is. Even with the restriction, many Vintage decks are still playing the 1 copy they are allowed. That, combined with the recent Standard reprint, means that the Mentor is likely to continue to build on its lead over Gideon ally of Zendikar. Those are the top 10 white Mythic Rares in Magic history. If you want to own any of these super powerful white cards, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to check out more than 800 other MTG top 10s, the playlist should be on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.